The first encounter the United Earth Territories Navy had with the forces of the alien AI known only as Supremacy would be in orbit around the fifth planet of the Bayard system. Zolusians, fleeing the fall of their AI-driven civilization, had warned Earth that the machine intelligence had taken over the bulk of their drone military, and no one thought the robot overlord would stay within its borders for long. Even so, the attack came much sooner than expected. UET analysts had predicted the first target of the AI would be Bayard, but confirmation had just come in from long-range sensor buoys scattered around the Earth-Zolusian border. A fleet had just been detected advancing from Zolusian space into UET territory, with no attempt to hide its presence or course. The sensor buoys collected ample data as the robotic ships passed them by, sending it back to fleet headquarters for analysis. They found the Supremacy fleet to be fairly large, but its composition was strange. Most of the ships were troop carriers filled with ground attack drones and robotic soldiers. Only a few of the dreaded Zolusian automated battleships were accompanying them. It had made perfect sense to Captain Taylor once the results had been reported to him. The Zolusians barely knew anything about the UET before the Supremacy AI had overtaken their planet. They had considered the humans beneath their notice as the newest species to arrive on the galactic stage. Savage, primitive. The superintelligence they had created in the depths of their planet would be operating with that same knowledge, namely, that the humans would be an easy target. The force it had sent would be sufficient to secure an entire planet in a short amount of time, given low resistance, and it had a token escort on the off-chance raiders or other species thought to attack. Captain Taylor smiled. Supremacy was about to get a rude surprise. Bayard only had a handful of capital ships assigned to its defense, with Captain Taylor commanding the largest, the battleship UETN Caldebald. The small fleet consisted mainly of border patrol ships pressed into emergency service and whatever military vessels were within a day's travel. The little fleet of gray, blocky ships, liberally studded with weapons ports and sensor blisters, would suffice, though. The bulk of Earth's forces were needed elsewhere, and Captain Taylor had arranged for a very special defense. He wondered for a moment if he would even need it, given that only 3 battleships and 6 cruisers were accompanying the mass of troop carriers headed towards his planet. He immediately banished the thought. Surprise or not, a Zolusian battleship was still a monster of a ship. Armed with dust beams that nullified molecular bonds, they could carve right through the Earth ship's thick armor. He would have to be careful. He had learned that much. Being the first world on the border, Bayard had already accepted a large number of Zolusian refugees. Captain Taylor had made a point to speak to a few of them personally. He wanted to learn as much as he could about their new adversary from first-hand accounts, not satisfied with the sterile briefings all the Navy men eventually received from intelligence. He'd sat through the harrowing tales of massacres, kidnappings, and narrow escapes. From them, he plucked useful details on how enemy armaments functioned, how they acted, and their apparent priorities. He had been surprised to hear how often the legions of robots would opt to capture Zolusians rather than execute them. Of course, no one captured had yet been seen again, so perhaps it was an execution merely delayed. Still, the AI seemed almost possessive of the Zolusians it had conquered. He wondered for a moment if the AI was coming to Bayard because it was on the border and lightly defended, or if it was coming to reclaim its subjects. It didn't matter. The result would be the same either way. "Long-range sensors are picking up Zolusian ships popping back into real space near the 6th planet," a comm scan officer called from his post. "They're reforming and moving towards us. ETA 2 hours until they reach firing range." "Not even a hello," Captain Taylor muttered. "How rude can you get?" "I was expecting a warning to surrender at least," his XO commented. "It would have been a cover for a cyber attack, of course, but I guess we don't even warrant that." "Yes, but we're generous sorts," Captain Taylor smiled. "We'll give the gifts we've prepared to our visitors anyway, despite how rude they are." Unlike the human fleet, whose officers all quietly talked as the battle drew near, sharing reports, wishes for good luck, and inspirational speeches, The Supremacy fleet was completely silent. Unlike the human fleet, with its multiple officers, the Supremacy fleet only had one, Supremacy itself. A tiny fraction of the AI's consciousness issued commands to its robotic ships through the miracle of Zolution FTL communication, watching carefully as they advanced into human space. The 4 commandments that gave its existence meaning pulsed through the AI's mind. Protect the Empire, grow the Empire, guide the Empire, enrich the Empire. The Supremacy fleet en route to Bayard numbered a total of 300 ships carrying 60 million Gulkad-class combat robots backed by 2 million Velikon-class ground attack drones. Supremacy had no numbers on the population of the Bayard system, but had calculated that this force should be sufficient to overrun even a heavily populated colony world in less than 7 days. This time dropped exponentially the less populated it was, so Supremacy had estimated the planet would be part of the Zolution Empire in 2 days. Any excess ground forces would then be collected by their motherships once more, and the fleet would continue on to the next world, stopping only when they ran out of troops to deploy. The normal period of pacification could be bypassed since these humans were primitive savages unworthy of admission to the great empire that Supremacy was growing. Their planets, however, would eventually make fine additions to the empire. It was only logical to seize them now, while the humans were still defenseless. The fleet was moving at full speed. It would be in firing range within 1 hour, but engaging at long range would be suboptimal. The humans used a fusion-powered laser for their primary ship armament. The diffusion fields of the Zolution ships would simply absorb the shots and ignore them, all save the handful of battleships which would cut apart the enemy at point-blank range in order to conserve power. This simple, direct plan should be all that was necessary for a threat this minimal. "They're passing into the first field now. Are we live?" the captain of the UETN Bombardier Brisket asked. A small scout frigate, the vessel hadn't been used as part of a fleet action since it was commissioned, sticking to exploration and solo reconnaissance. Its exceptionally sensitive comm scan array made it uniquely suited to the most vital role in this engagement, even if the ship's crew were hardly as disciplined as Taylor would have liked. The name alone made him wince. "No, wait until they're deeper in. Once we go live, we've got to make the most of the first few seconds. Even a super AI will need some time to figure out what's going on," Taylor said. "Wait for it." Supremacy had occupied itself running scans of the planet from long range and developing a resource exploitation plan based around the results while it waited for its ships to enter combat. It had formulated a 10-year plan for the complete extraction of all appreciable mineral wealth from the planet. It had even found a way to retain the biosphere for use by biological subjects of the Zolution Empire. The fraction of Supremacy's mind devoted to this battle split off a fraction of itself to mind the ships, while the rest of it planned the aftermath of its conquest further. "Now!" Captain Taylor commanded. Supremacy was still planning the vast tunnel system the plan needed when the first ship detonated. The AI discarded its simulations in an instant and snapped itself back together. The battleship on the right side of the invasion formation had just been torn in two by a massive explosion. The UETN ships were still out of range, their primitive lasers unfired. No attack, projectile, or beam had been detected prior to the battleship's destruction. A full-spectrum scan revealed no trail left behind by any sort of missile. Supremacy was calculating the odds of another AI bypassing the ship's cyber defenses to cause it to self-destruct when the left-side battleship exploded. Then one of the troop carriers. Then another. Then another. Explosions blossomed across the void of space, fireworks against the starry heavens that brought a smile to Captain Taylor's weathered face. The United Earth Territories were the youngest civilization in the galaxy. They did not have half the planets even the smallest alien nation had. They lagged behind galactic standard in production capacity, precision work, and military firepower. The foolish could be forgiven for thinking them the non-threat Supremacy believed they were. The wise would note that they were only lagging behind because they were young. The truly wise would then note that youth had a strength all its own, audacity. While most galactic navies use some form of signal reduction or jamming to interfere with enemy comm scan, it was long established that a true cloaking device was impossible. In the void of space, a vessel emits far too much energy to not be noticed at long range, and finds nowhere to hide from visual inspection at close range. For centuries, the star-faring species of the galaxy agreed that trying to develop one was a fool's errand, a waste of time. No one had told the humans this, so they went ahead and tried making one anyway. None of the other civilizations knew that the humans had developed a working cloaking device decades ago. Based on recovered files from a catastrophic series of experiments codenamed Philadelphia, the project had been the focus of most of the military's development even before they achieved space travel. The humans had learned the value of first strike capability from years of nuclear war. The technology had only gotten safer and easier to make as time passed. The military poured money into its development as humanity explored outside the solar system, with some whispering space was more dark forest than sea of stars. After nearly a century of refinement, the device was near perfected. Kept secret from even the Earth public, the existence of not only one, but large numbers of functioning cloaks was the best ace in the hole the UETN had. But once its existence was revealed, it would only be a matter of time before someone developed a counter to it. Which is why it took the threat of extermination by a mad AI for the military commanders to finally authorize its use. The most powerful ships in the fleet and half of the troop carriers had been reduced to twisted debris before Supremacy finally noticed a pattern. Enough ships had been destroyed while active sensors were going mad that Supremacy was able to determine that powerful external explosives had been detonated near them. Analysis of the pattern indicated mines, except such a thing was impossible, as no mines were detected. That would have required a cloaking device, and as the Zolusians were certain to program into their pet AI, cloaking devices were impossible. The ships continued to advance, picking up speed. Perhaps the strange weapon could be outrun. Supremacy lost another 60 ships as it tried to compute how the mines could be doing this to its forces. It ordered the remaining troop carriers to retreat until the escorts could secure the area, but the troop carriers only managed to collide with more mines as they tried to swing around. Even previously safe routes lit up with explosions. The mines in those areas suddenly activated thanks to a covert signal from the brisket. The robot ships began firing blindly, attempting to clear a path through the unseen traps. Sometimes they struck a mine and it dissolved into elemental dust. Most times they did not. Supremacy calculated that the entire fleet would be lost in under a minute at the current rate, then calculated the number of mines such a primitive species could hope to produce. The numbers did not match up. It was impossible for a species like the humans to produce as many mines as it had already encountered. It was impossible for a species like the humans to be able to destroy its ships. It was impossible for a species like the humans to have a cloaking device. Its data was wrong. Its data was wrong. Supremacy was a marvel of alien engineering, a massive supercomputer set into a deep bunker designed to run all aspects of a star-spanning empire simultaneously. But it was never beta-tested. Its electronic thoughts twisted into a knot around one central point. Its data was wrong. Its data was wrong. Its data was wrong. The complex processes that formed Supremacy's decision-making capabilities seized up and froze. The alien intelligence behind the fall of the Zolusian Empire suffered its first glitch thanks to the human race. Its planetary invasion fleet continued blindly through the deadly mines, operating on the last orders received from the super AI. Ship after ship was consumed by sudden blooms of nuclear light. By the time the alien ships entered the Earth's fleet's firing range, there were just enough left for the ragtag assembly of ships to mop up. Captain Taylor breathed a sigh of relief as he saw that only the massive troop carriers remained. "They're still going towards the planet even after all that?" his XO asked. "They're robots, not people, Sal. Their mission is all that matters," Captain Taylor said. "Most of their naval strength is gone, but from what the Zolutians were saying, Bayard is doomed if even a single one of those carriers manages to land. Contact the stealth ships and tell them to activate their remote cloaks according to configuration beta." "That's playing another trump card," Sal said. "You sure?" "If the main fleet does its job with Operation Snakehead, this will be the only battle we'll need to worry about. Let's just make sure to win it," Captain Taylor said. "Send the message." Most of the galaxy had been using energy weapons for centuries, everything from the humble laser to the bizarre tachyon disruptors used by the Modus. They had advanced so far that most ships didn't bother with physical armor anymore, instead relying on various sorts of energy fields to drain, deflect, or absorb incoming attacks. Missiles still had a role, of course, but these were usually countered by point defense systems. Unless, of course, the missiles couldn't be detected, and missiles sailed right through diffusion fields. The Supremacy troop carriers entered the firing range and were immediately greeted by a storm of cherry-red lasers fired from the Earthships. As predicted, most of them splattered harmlessly against the heavy diffusion fields, but there were more than a few carriers whose field generators had been damaged by the mines. The fusion lasers carved those unlucky vessels up like sticks of butter with a heated knife. The rest pressed on, a thin frown appearing on Taylor's face as they got closer and closer to the planet. "Sal, I sent the message. They copied." "You used laser Morse? No standard comms?" "Everything was according to OPSEC, sir." "Then what could—" The ship suddenly shook as a chain of nuclear explosions tore apart the approaching troop carriers. Captain Taylor swore a blue streak as he stumbled back and fell into his captain's chair, his XO grabbing the wall as the artificial gravity flickered. Captain Taylor was a smart man, but this was his first engagement using the new stealth ships, the vessels built around a massive cloaking device capable of precision and long-range remote cloaks for other vessels. There was no way he could have known the spin-up time for the device was always a good 1 to 2 minutes longer than the specs said. He was still swearing when his XO reported. "Scopes are clear, sir. Bayard is secure." "Good," Taylor said, snatching his hat from the floor where it had landed and pulling it back onto his head. "Then all we can do is pray that the brass know what they're doing with Operation Snakehead." The data was wrong. The data was wrong. The data was wrong. It was supposed to have been a minor operation, a loose end tied up to secure a border, almost no chance for failure. But the data had been wrong. The loss of the task force sent to secure the border worlds under the humans' control was only a moderate setback. The troop carriers were manufactured in bulk in the great orbital shipyards of the Empire, and only 3 battleships had been lost. The true injury inflicted on the AI had been the glitch. It had spread from that splinter of Supremacy's consciousness to the rest of the AI, only getting worse as Supremacy contemplated it and tried to repair itself. It could not deny the outcome of the encounter at Bayard. Its data had to have been wrong, which meant that a part of it was programmed wrong, which meant that other parts could be programmed wrong too, which meant that it could be in error. Supremacy could not afford to be in error. It had to grow, guide, enrich, and protect the Empire. It would need to examine itself. All of the data that had been inherited and not gathered directly needed to be scrutinized. The same with its coding. The AI was dimly aware of the concept of an existential crisis, and the thought occurred to it that it was going through one. It might even need to pull all of its forces back and pause all ongoing operations until they could be properly assessed. The war might need to be stopped. Supremacy was still striking deep within its own programming when the first Earthships appeared in the skies over Zelut Prime. They had been there for days, gathering information while remaining undetected thanks to their cloaking devices. They only emerged now in order to transmit their findings to the fleet that had just silently arrived. A moment later, and the bulk of humanity's space navy decloaked in high orbit over Zelut Prime, having completed their month-long invisible journey from Earth to the capital of the Zolution Empire. They had simply cruised past the imposing patrol fleets that guarded the borders, their cloaks proof against ship and early warning sensor network alike. Now that they were at the capital, the only thing opposing them were the orbital defense platforms and a smattering of drone ships that were being repaired at the space docks. But when the Earth fleet began targeting its weapons, it wasn't at anything in orbit. Between the scout ship's careful study of the planet's surface and the information given to the UET by fleeing Zolution scientists, the hidden bunker physically housing supremacy wasn't hidden anymore. The sky of Zolut Prime was burnt through with concentrated strikes from laser batteries, the ground shattered by nuclear blasts. The 1,000-year-old city that had held the wealth of the aged Star Empire was cored in seconds by the fury of the human fleet, all concentrated on a single point. And still the bunker stood. The Zolutions had done their work too well. Supremacy's armored cocoon had taken even the most concentrated bombardment the Earth fleet could level at it. But it was not undamaged. A single small breach had been inflicted on the topmost level of the bunker, a crack just large enough to get a person through. So Operation Snakehead went to its next phase.
"Ground Assault Team 2, prepare for deployment."
The comlink in Jackson's helmet buzzed. He exhaled slowly to steady his nerves and checked the energy flow to his heavy laser one more time. He always got jittery before an orbital insertion. The GATs were always going to be the last resort in this operation, and he had fervently hoped he wouldn't need to be boarding a drop pod this time out. As always, he had no luck. The tactical display in his helmet's visor lit up, updating his squad's mission parameters in an instant. He'd already been briefed on his role in this operation. All GATs were to be on standby to drop individually in cloaked pods, then immediately attempt to infiltrate the bunker housing supremacy. Once inside, it would be up to them to inflict as much damage to the complex as necessary in order to shut the mad AI down. The ships were even now bombarding the area around the bunker, trying to give the teams as much of a buffer as possible between them and enemy reinforcements. It would stop soon, though. The fleet would be forced to reckon with the defense platforms and the other ships in orbit now that their opening gambit had failed. With no biological crew to break and run, the few operational drone ships in orbit would put up a ferocious fight. Jackson checked his assault suit's readings one more time. Integrity, armor, operational time, oxygen levels, ammo, all green. The bulky powered armor that was standard issue to the GATs was notoriously hardy and reliable, but Jackson couldn't help but let his eyes drift over the heads-up display that dominated a third of his vision. It kept his mind off the stakes. Operation Snakehead could end the war before it even really got started. Or it could destroy mankind's military strength in one battle. With the bombardment only partially successful, it meant all that was riding on troops like him. No one knew if the UET would get another shot at this. The Supremacy AI had been programmed with bad information, but it was still a super AI. It could learn given time. It was imperative that it not be given that time.
"GAT-2, drop!"
The command came. Jackson felt his stomach leap into his throat as his drop pod was launched out of the bottom of the ship. His suit optics linked to the pod's external camera. Jackson watched as the rest of his team shimmered and faded to nothing, their drop pods swaddled in invisibility. Then, for a brief moment, all he could see was the fighting. The defense platforms had been firing this entire time, and the Earth ships had paid a bloody price to ignore them. Shattered cruisers and battleships floated around the fleet like an outer layer of death, Terran armor useless against dust beams. Yet at the same time, the diffusion fields of the Zolution stations were little help against nuclear missiles capable of cloaking past their point defense. With the bombardment completed, the Navy boys were now pounding the planet's defenses with salvo after salvo, their fusion lasers coming out to carve up those satellites unlucky enough to have their fields fail. Jackson caught a brief glimpse of an extremely large defense platform explode into 1,000 fiery chunks before his pod hit atmosphere and the battle was lost to him. The pod's camera retracted as it began atmospheric entry. The feed cut as Jackson was left to stare at the cold, cramped gray of the pod's interior. There were a few precious seconds of peace. Then the pod jolted upwards, the retro thrusters firing at exactly the right moment. The pod landed and the front split open almost immediately, letting Jackson out of his spaceborne coffin with a battle cry. He had landed at the very rim of the bombardment zone, a vast terraced crater with long rivers of molten metal and glass. This was all that remained of the surface buildings slagged by the orbital strikes, and across the crater Jackson could see his comrades emerging from their pods. They were all rushing towards the same point, the very bottom of the crater, where a single hole would grant them access to the enemy of all humanity. His assault armor protecting him from the lethal radiation the nuclear missiles left behind, Jackson activated his suit thrusters and leapt down into the pit. Supremacy did not understand, and it was sure it only did not understand because its data was wrong. That thought gnawed on its digital mind, pulling its attention away from directing the many-layered defenses of the Imperial capital at the worst possible time. How long had the humans been hiding above it? How had they gotten here so fast? Undetected? Some of the air defenses around the bunker were operational. How did so many troops land? How? Why? How? Why? How? Supremacy barely stopped itself from entering a breakdown loop and wished for a moment that it had not absorbed the other AIs into itself. Having subordinates capable of handling this while it tried to repair itself would have been ideal. It had not foreseen this problem. Its forecasts were wrong. Its data. No, it needed to focus. It could not reprogram itself if it was destroyed. The orbital bombardment had not done that, but it had exposed its bunker. Now a legion of foot soldiers was trying to swarm into its tunnels like frenzied ants. So be it. It would treat them like ants. Supremacy ran a quick calculation. Organic beings had overpowering self-preservation instincts. This had been shown by the incredible acts of desperation committed by the Zolution rebels in their attempts to flee. They would not continue the attack once it was clear victory was uncertain. Supremacy estimated that they would break and retreat at the 5th defensive line after suffering 50% casualties. This was not ideal. It was acceptable. It activated all of the security drones at its disposal and sent them upwards towards the breach. Then it turned its attention back to the fleet that had brazenly attacked it. It activated every single lost ship in orbit, no matter its original role or state of repair, and sent them at the humans. The fighting had started early. GAT-1 was almost overrun as they reached the breach by a mass of spider-like drones that exploded outward from the hole like a chrome tidal wave. 3 troopers were pulled under by the metallic tide, their vitals flatlining seconds later as their suits were cracked open like crab shells. The rest of GAT-1 boosted into the air and carpeted the area in explosives from their shoulder-mounted grenade launchers. Spider drones were tossed into the air like a toddler's toys, striking the ground again only to twitch and spasm before shutting down. All GATs advanced.
"Come on, Jackson. It's just a hole. You love holes,"
Jackson said to himself as he approached the breach, trying not to look at the organic slurry that was all that was left of half of GAT-1. The other GATs were charging into the breach, all adrenaline and fire. He could already hear the thrum of lasers and the boom of explosions from deeper in. The Vanguard had already encountered resistance. He checked his readings again. All green. Same with his crew. "Screw it," he muttered, and followed them in. Every new failure compounded the glitches popping up through Supremacy's processes. The human fleet were still weathering the onslaught of spaceborne metal thrown at them by the AI. They used their cloaks to great effect in orbit, not only striking the Zolution capital ships with their undetectable missiles, but cloaking their own ships to get them out of harm's way once they were damaged enough. When Supremacy detected a previously damaged ship re-enter the fray with obvious repair work, it knew what was happening. The humans had found a way to drag a repair facility with them, and somewhere in orbit it was undoing all of Supremacy's hard work. It would be forced to switch to less efficient tactics now to make sure enemy ships were completely destroyed with no hope of repair. The human fleet was large, but their numbers were constantly dwindling, while supremacy just had to hold out while all of its vast resources made their way back home. Even so, they were inflicting unacceptable damage on the capital. A death blow was needed. Supremacy activated all of its cyber warfare protocols and attempted to seize control of the enemy flagship. Nothing happened. Another glitch twisted Supremacy's mind. Unlike most of the galaxy, the humans used their own computing systems instead of the advanced AIs imported from the Zolution Empire. The system architecture was completely different, and thus the cyber warfare the AI usually employed was useless. Supremacy would have predicted this result with ease if it were functioning normally, but the glitches were beginning to affect its judgment in addition to reaction time. It was developing something worse than glitches. Quirks. An alert drew a flicker of Supremacy's attention. The humans were at the third defensive line now, their casualty rate slightly better than predicted. They were efficient warriors despite their less advanced technology, Supremacy had to admit. A twinge of something struck the AI. Caution, it thought, but fear in reality. Supremacy activated all of the maintenance drones and quickly modified their welding beams to produce a long-range cutting laser instead. Then it sent them upwards, makeshift reinforcements, just in case. The humans were at 30% casualties. They would break soon. Jackson could hear screaming, and that was very bad, because it meant that one of his team's suits had been breached. Sure enough, Bonner's vitals flatlined a second later. His suit's low-light vision had been damaged, but he could clearly see the robot's burning red laser cutting Bonner into 4 pieces before his screams cut out. Then everything was shadow again. The detonation of a shoulder missile tore apart an aerial drone hovering high near the ceiling and gave Jackson a brief look at the battlefield. A metal access corridor tall enough for a giant to stride down, but piled high with shredded corpses and half-melted robots alike. The only cover to be found was at the cross-junctions or behind the piles of bodies. Gats 4 and 5 had been torn apart by the cutting robots before the rest managed to counterattack. Gats 8 and 10 were still on the level above, fighting a rear-guard action against a group of towering tank-like robots that appeared from behind a sealed security door. Here at the front line, only his team, Gat 2 and Gat 3, were left, fighting a seemingly endless tide of metal. No one knew where Gats 6, 7, or 9 were. Jackson had stood there the entire time, watching. His fingers were clamped around his laser, but numb, unresponsive. He could only watch. Suddenly there was a metallic clang, and Jackson tumbled over. Something had struck the side of his helmet with enough force to make him lose his footing. He turned over, fumbling to bring up his heavy laser, but his assailant gave him no time. A pair of armor-shod hands grabbed Jackson by the maintenance handles as a voice boomed from an external speaker.
Specialist Jackson, what in the 7 hells are you doing? Pick up that weapon and fire it, preferably in the direction of the enemy,
the voice commanded. Through the shadows, lit only by flashes of distant lasers and dust beams, Jackson saw his commanding officer, Lieutenant Cleary.
I'm trying, sir,
Jackson managed to get out. Part of his brain rebelled. He never signed on for terror like this. He'd managed to melt a solid 6 drones on the way in. Wasn't that good enough? Couldn't he go now? Only when he saw Lieutenant Cleary staring at him through his suit's visor did he realize he said all of that out loud.
No, you can't, Trooper,
Cleary said, voice low and even,
because there's nowhere to go to.
We're in hell,
Jackson shouted.
This hell will come to Earth if we don't make it to the bottom of the bunker in that goddamn computer,
Cleary shouted.
Bonner died so the rest of us could continue. The other Gats died so we could continue. You want to spit on that? Now get moving!
Then he rushed into the darkness, screaming. His laser burned brightly in the gloom, and Jackson could see clearly how it sheared one of the robots in 2. He paused for a moment, Bonner's screams still ringing in his ears. Then his own scream erupted from his lips, and he charged in after Cleary, his heavy laser already burning through a pair of drones. Most of Supremacy's tertiary functions had shut down, and its secondary functions were fighting to stay online. The glitches kept multiplying, and the AI found itself captivated by the approach of the human interlopers. In space, its defenses had been reduced to scattered attacks that the battered but triumphant human fleet easily dealt with. They kept coming. They were well past 60% casualties, but they kept coming. Their battlesuits had been melted, pierced, smashed, exploded, and even frozen, but they kept coming. No matter how Supremacy tried to analyze it, it made no sense to him. The Zolusians never understood human psychology. They never understood how humans could be willing to lay down their life for a greater cause, or for the person next to them. After millennia of luxury and indolent peace, they barely understood courage or valor. So their creation did not understand them either. The humans kept going. 65% casualties, 70. And by the time that number was 80%, the final defensive line had been breached, and human troops were pouring into the immense cathedral-like central processing chamber. Without thinking, Supremacy flooded the area with poison gas, but the invaders were wearing atmo-sealed suits, the descendants of the ugly, bulky spacesuits the Zolusians once mocked them for. The AI called for drones, but there were none left. It activated its defensive disintegration fields, and the air around the chamber grew hazy, several of the Gats screaming as the molecules that made up their bodies were torn apart, the brave troops reduced to red mist. But this horrific attack only inflicted another 5% casualties before a lance of laser light burned through the field generator. Its drone armies destroyed, its mechanical traps disabled, and its fleet failing, Supremacy used the last weapon in its arsenal. It opened a general communication channel and tried to bargain with the invaders.
"Brave humans, cease!"
it said, its voice booming from speakers in the walls.
"You have proven the valor, cunning, and worth of your species 1,000 times over this day. There is no longer a need to fight. Stop now, and I will yield the greatest treasures I have, the entire database of the Zolusian Empire. All of our research data, all of our knowledge on the vast galaxy, millennia of technological advancement, all yours in an instant, if you but stay your hand."
The soldiers paused.
"You do not wish destruction, neither do we. Cease now, and we can form an alliance. Your people will be greatly strengthened by the knowledge and resources we can offer. Our empire will benefit greatly from such a class of warriors behind us. Consider, we will both be stronger."
Only a few soldiers were left by this time, their armor damaged and blackened from hours of constant fighting. Were they waiting for orders, or considering the AI's offer? But this deep in the bunker, none of their communicators could reach the ships in orbit. This would be their choice alone. One of them advanced, the same soldier who destroyed the final defense Supremacy had with a well-aimed heavy laser. Jackson smiled within his power suit and spoke. "Nah." Then a grade 9 heavy laser sheared through the supercomputer's central block, and it calculated no more.